Welcome to episode 8 of Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and it has been with me ever since. This is a quote from America's first serial killer, Hh Holmes. But how much of his infamous story is fact and how much is myth? Holmes was born in New Hampshire on May 16, 1861. His real name was actually Herman Webster Mudgett. Not quite as catchy, is it? I'll stick to calling him Holmes. Holmes married a woman named Clara Loveling. They had a son together named Robert. Holmes studied at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, graduating in 1882. While in school, he worked in the anatomy lab, learning vital skills for his career in medicine. One thing we know for sure about Holmes is that he was a scammer and con artist. Starting in med school, he would use the cadavers to scam insurance companies. He would take out life insurance policies, then burn or mutilate the corpses and plant the bodies somewhere to be found. He made it look like there was some sort of accident, and then he collected the money. He also stole cadavers and skeletons and sold them for a profit. I'm not sure how many cadavers this medical school has stocked up, but I feel like you would notice this many were missing. Holmes did not treat his wife very kindly. He was physically abusive towards her. Clara took Robert and moved back to New Hampshire. After graduating, he worked as an apprentice with Dr. White, a doctor who focused primarily on human dissection, another skill that was vital for his career as, well, a serial killer. After his apprenticeship, Holmes moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He landed his first job working at a local pharmacy. There was an incident where a young boy died after taking the drugs that Holmes prescribed and dispensed for him. He denied having any involvement with the death, but suspiciously skipped town directly after this happened. He landed in the Windy City, Chicago, Illinois. He changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid any connections to his previous scams. Holmes marries another woman named Myrta Belknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But he was technically still married to Clara. I'm guessing they didn't really have the greatest documentation or laws against multiple marriages in the 1800s. But this was not a sister-wife situation. From what I'm reading, his wives were not aware of each other. He filed for divorce from his first wife, Clara. He claimed she was unfaithful. Dude, you straight up married another woman. There was no proof of Clara's infidelity, and the divorce never went through. Holmes and Myrta also had a child, a girl named Lucy. But 2 wives just wasn't enough. He married a third woman, Georgia Yoke, in 1894. He must have traveled a lot because he met and wed Georgia in Denver, Colorado. I guess long-distance marriages must have been a thing. I have so many questions about this. Somehow he was able to keep up with multiple marriages without the other women finding out. While in Chicago, Holmes worked at the Elizabeth S. Holton drugstore. He eventually bought the pharmacy and the empty lot across the street. On that lot, he built what would be dubbed the Murder Castle, or Murder Mansion by the media. It was a multi-purpose building. The first floor was a full block of retail space, including a new pharmacy. The second floor was constructed into long-term rental apartments. Holmes himself lived in an apartment there. During the construction of the building, it's believed that Holmes had a more sinister plan than just retail stores and apartments. He frequently switched architects and builders to hide the oddity of it, but also so he could claim bad workmanship and get out of paying for their services. He paid little to nothing for this building during construction. Let's talk a little bit more about this murder castle. The rooms on the second floor had some unique features. There were iron plates lined inside the walls, which made them soundproof. Some of the rooms were airtight and hooked up to a pipeline. Holmes would flood the room with gas to kill his victims. There were hinged walls and secret passages, hallways that seemed like a maze, some which led to nowhere. Some rooms had 5 doors, where others had none. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to this design. I'll post pictures of the layout on my Facebook and Instagram page. From the second floor, there were a few chutes that led straight down to the basement, but it wasn't used as a laundry chute. Holmes used them to quickly get his victims past the first floor down to the basement. Once bodies made it to the basement, they were placed on a surgical table where Holmes used his medical skills to dismember them. Organs were sold on the black market, flesh was completely removed from the bones, and then the skeletons were sold to medical institutions. Any remains left were cremated in a human-sized oven or placed into vats of acid to get rid of any evidence. Holmes refused to pay both the steel company and the architects for the build. They both sued him in 1888. After construction was complete, Holmes placed ads in the local newspapers. The ads were for jobs within the building, as well as advertising himself as a wealthy man looking for a new wife. Geesh, how many wives do you need, Holmes? Many women came to the castle in response to his ad. Everyone was required to have a life insurance policy, with Holmes or one of his many aliases listed as the beneficiary. Those people started to disappear. One of his first noted victims was a woman named Julia Smythe and her daughter Pearl. Julia worked at the jewelry counter on the first floor of the building. She was a married woman. When her husband Ned Connor heard about the affair with Holmes, he left Julia and their daughter. On Christmas Eve, 1891, Julia and Pearl both disappeared. No one ever saw them again. The names of two other women that worked in the building and vanished were Emmeline Segrande and Edna Van Tassel. In 1892, Holmes added a third story to his building. He told his investors he was going to make the rooms available as a hotel. There were many events in Chicago that brought tons of tourists into town, including the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition and the Chicago World Fair. But the third floor was never completed. Holmes was stealing from his furniture supplier and stashing things in his secret rooms and hidden passages within the building. He never paid for any of it. When this was discovered, his investors pulled out. Holmes became close friends with a man named Benjamin Piddizel. He was a carpenter, but also a criminal. He became Holmes's right-hand man in his fraudulent schemes. In 1893, Holmes was hired as... In 1893, Holmes hired a woman named Minnie Williams as his personal stenographer, which I had to Google. It's like record keeping using shorthand. Apparently, Holmes was a very charming and convincing guy. He won Minnie over romantically. Then he talked her into signing over the deed to a property she owned in Fort Worth, Texas. It was signed over to Alexander Bond, one of Holmes's many aliases. Then Holmes later added the name Benton T. Lyman to the deed. That was an alias that Benjamin Piddizel used. It is so crazy that you can just pretend to be someone you're not and get away with it. I wonder what a form of identification was like then. This was way before driver's licenses and social security cards. I think they probably had passports or maybe just birth certificates, but easily forged, I'm sure. Anyways, Minnie was head over heels for Holmes. They began renting an apartment together in Chicago's Lincoln Park. She invited her cousin Annie to come visit and meet her new man. After July 5th, 1893, neither Minnie nor Annie were ever seen again. Afterwards, Holmes headed to his brand new property in Fort Worth, Texas. Thanks, Minnie. It was a prime location on the corner of a busy intersection, much like his murder castle in Chicago. He started the process of building there, and of course he cheated and swindled his way through the entire process. July 1894, Holmes was arrested for selling mortgaged goods, which means he sold items that didn't actually belong to him. He was selling the stolen pieces of furniture he stashed away in the secret rooms of his Chicago building. While imprisoned, he befriended another inmate, Marion Hedgepeth. Holmes shared his next fraudulent plan with him. He was going to fake his own death and collect the life insurance money. Hedgepeth offered to help him for a price. He hooked him up with a trusted lawyer in St. Louis in exchange for $500. The lawyer's name was Jephthah Howe. Howe was intrigued by Holmes's plan and agreed to help him. Howe was to become the beneficiary to his life insurance policy. They would burn a cadaver and pretend it was Holmes. He would then retreat to his Fort Worth property under a new alias. The policy he purchased for himself was for $10,000. The insurance company was suspicious and denied the claim. Since that plan failed, the criminal duo decided to try the same scheme with his buddy Benjamin Pitzel. Similarly, they planned to use a cadaver and disfigure it. Pitzel would pretend to be an inventor and use the alias B.F. Perry. They were to assume that this inventor had a terrible accident and was disfigured in an explosion. Even Pitzel's wife was in on the scheme. They were going to split the insurance money 3 ways, between the Pitzel family, Holmes, and Howe. But Holmes couldn't take the chance of missing out on the profit this time. He wasn't going to use a cadaver. He needed the real thing. He surprised Pitzel by knocking him out with chloroform. Then he set his body on fire. This was his friend, his partner in crime. But Holmes was cold-hearted and money-hungry. Holmes lied to Pitzel's wife. He told her that Benjamin left to hide out in London after the scheme took place. Holmes was able to sway people to do things they wouldn't normally do, like when he had Minnie sign over the deed to her property. Well, now he convinced Mrs. Pitzel that she should move to Canada for safety, away from the mess of this scandal. She had 5 children. She took her eldest child and her infant with her, leaving the other 3 children in the care of Holmes. For some reason, Holmes followed her all the way to Canada. I'm not sure why he did this, but Mrs. Pitzel was unaware she was being tailed. And Holmes was not the best choice as a caretaker for the children. He locked the 2 young girls, Alice and Nellie, into a trunk. He then fed a hose into a hole which made a miniature gas chamber. He buried their naked bodies in the cellar of a rental property in Toronto. After killing the girls, he drove to Indianapolis. Holmes had one more Pitzel child under his care, a boy named Howard. Once in Indianapolis, he made 2 stops, one at a pharmacy to buy drugs and another stop at a repair shop where he had a knife sharpened. He rented a cottage where he forced Howard to take the drugs. He took his freshly sharpened knife and dismembered his body. He then burned the pieces of Howard to get rid of any evidence of his crime. Little did Holmes know, police were right on his heels. Detective Frank Grier from the Philadelphia Police Department was assigned to investigate Holmes. He discovered the bodies of Alice and Nellie in Toronto. Then he was able to trace his steps to Indianapolis, where the pharmacist and the repair shop worker confirmed that Holmes had been there. But Grier was too late to save Howard, and Holmes was long gone. After these discoveries of the Pitzel children, police searched Holmes's building in Chicago. They discovered that it was elaborately designed for torture, hence the dubbed name Murder Castle. When they searched the basement, they found multiple operating tables with surgical tools nearby. One table was covered in blood with a pile of women's clothing next to it. They found vats of acid and a human-sized oven. Between that and discovering the gas chamber rooms on the 2nd floor, police knew they were looking at a killer. However, the term serial killer wasn't coined until the 1970s, and H.H. Holmes was said to be America's first. His murders weren't what took him down. It was the theft and scamming that led police to Holmes. If he were just a murderer, he probably would have gotten away with it. At this point, Holmes was still at large. There was a warrant out for his arrest for a horse theft he committed in Texas. He was finally tracked down in Boston, Massachusetts by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Holmes was charged with the murder of Benjamin Pitzel and sentenced to death. They knew he also killed his 3 children, but I guess they didn't see a point in charging him when he's already scheduled for hanging. While imprisoned, the Hearst newspaper paid Holmes a large sum of money for a confession. He met with a journalist and confessed to 27 murders and 6 attempted murders. Holmes claimed to be possessed by Satan. He said the longer he stayed in prison, his appearance changed. His face became sunken in and a darker feeling took over, as if he was taking on the persona of Satan himself. Holmes was aware of what grave robbers were capable of doing to bodies. I mean, he spent years dissecting corpses and selling off their body parts. He requested that his body be encased with cement inside of his coffin. He also wanted to be buried 10 feet deep, making him more difficult to access than the typical 6 feet under. I'm not sure why he received this special treatment, but he was indeed encased with cement and buried 10 feet deep, then covered with another 7 3,000-pound barrels of cement. That seems a bit excessive. Holmes, don't you know the golden rule? Whatever you desire for men to do to you, you should also do to them. So maybe you shouldn't have hacked people up. Just saying. May 7th, 1896, Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. During a hanging, you typically die immediately from what is called a hangman's fracture. The noose would force the head into hyperextension by the weight of the body. In this case, a hangman's fracture did not occur. Holmes hung there for 20 minutes twitching until he died of asphyxiation. A year earlier, in 1895, 2 men were seen fleeing the back door of the murder castle, shortly followed by explosions, and the building went up in flames. The structure survived, but the interior wasn't salvageable. Could this have been planned by Holmes, another insurance fraud scheme? He had the building insured by 4 separate companies, none of which paid out. I think these insurance companies were catching on to him. The second and third stories were torn down and rebuilt. The building lasted until the 1930s. The site of the murder castle is now used by the U.S. Postal Service. That is the story of H. Holmes, the White City Devil, America's first serial killer. Now I will attempt to debunk just about everything I said. Let's jump back to the beginning. When Holmes was in medical school, apparently it was a rite of passage for the students to sell off cadaver body parts for money. He wasn't the only one doing it. Again, how the hell does this go unnoticed? The story of him doing this once he was living in Chicago has no evidence to back it up. One man came forward to police and said he had bought bodies from Holmes, but this story didn't stick. The main problem with this case is that it happened over 125 years ago. Evidence to prove crimes were committed was nothing like it is today. No forensic evidence. Fingerprints weren't even used in criminal cases until 1911. Crimes were mostly confirmed by witness accounts. Some believe the real reason Holmes built the secret rooms and hidden passageways was simply so that he could hide stolen goods without being caught. Most homes at that time had chutes used for laundry, and a stove in the basement wasn't unusual as they were used for heat. While some of the rooms on the second floor were reported to be soundproof, the basement was not. It's thought to be a myth that the basement was used as a torture chamber. People would be able to hear what was happening down there. Anyone who lived or worked in the building had access to the basement. It wasn't a personal lair for Holmes. There was indeed a pit of quicklime, but it seemed to be unused, as well as a 12-foot tank full of gas. It seemed plausible that he could kill and dispose of bodies this way, but no proof that it actually happened. Adam Selzer, author of H. Holmes, The True Story of the White City Devil, says with confidence that Holmes killed at least 9 people. All of which were people he knew, not people who came through his murder castle. It's a myth that he killed guests that stayed in his, you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes, hotel. The 3rd floor was never finished, therefore never used as a hotel like Holmes had planned. The 2nd floor was used only for long-term rentals. Millions of people attended the Chicago World Fair and thousands went missing. That's where the inflation of the victim numbers came from. In the 1890s, something called yellow journalism was a popular way of writing. It's where the stories were largely exaggerated or completely fabricated. Fake news. Another myth about Holmes was the quote I used to the intro of this episode. The Philadelphia Inquirer was going to publish the Holmes murder confessions. The Philadelphia North American felt they needed to one-up the Inquirer. That's where the quote was first publicized and spread throughout history. But the truth is, Holmes never uttered those words. It was not in his confession at all. The North American more than likely completely made it up. Yellow journalism. Which would now probably be considered libel, defamation, or a slew of other things that could land you in a jail cell. The media claimed police found women's clothing and a surgical table in the basement, both covered in blood. This part I have trouble believing. I don't think Holmes would have left that mess behind, especially if anyone in the building had access to the basement. By the time the building was searched, Holmes had been gone for some time. I doubt he would just leave a bloody mess in the basement of a multi-purpose building like that. Harold Schechter, author of Depraved, The Shocking True Story of America's First Serial Killer, believes that all the claims of Holmes killing people in his murder castle are fiction. I have mixed feelings about this. When he killed the Pittisel girls, he created a mini gas chamber. If he is capable of killing the young girls this way, who is to say that isn't what happened to the women who went missing that worked in his building? But at the same time, there's no evidence that it did happen either. Another problem with getting to the truth about Hh Holmes, he was a con artist and habitual liar. Getting any real information straight from the source was proven difficult. He gave false confessions to the Hearst newspaper. Holmes told police where to dig in the basement of the castle to find skeletons, but none were ever recovered. Then, as he stood in front of a crowd at his death sentence, he proclaimed his innocence. He swore he had only ever killed 2 people. He said these 2 women died after he performed medical procedures on them. But here he was being executed for murdering his friend, Benjamin Pittisel, and the detective had followed him, finding a trail of murdered Pittisel children. Someone's lying here. Hh Holmes is infamously known as America's first serial killer. But was he really? Or was he just a scam artist who killed people that got in his way? To quote an article, Top 10 Myths About Hh Holmes, posted on mysteriouschicago.com, I don't think I could word it better myself. Quote, Holmes was more of a Walter White than a Hannibal Lecter, unquote. He wasn't out there just mindlessly killing people to fulfill a need within him. It seemed like he only killed people that stood in his way of achieving a specific goal. He did kill multiple people, which by definition makes him a serial killer, but he wasn't the first in America, not even the first in Chicago. Thomas Neil Cream was a Scottish-Canadian serial killer. He started his killing spree in the United States, then made his way to Great Britain, and finally Canada before being caught. Cream, too, was a medical professional. In 1880, he established a medical practice near the red light district of Chicago. He provided illegal abortions to prostitutes. There were many cases of abortions gone wrong and poisoning, all which were women who died under the care of Dr. Cream. Was he the original Dr. Death? If you haven't listened to that podcast, you definitely should. It makes you question the medical profession altogether. The biggest conspiracy theory surrounding Hh Holmes is that he escaped from his hanging, swapping another convict to stand in his place while he disappeared. History Channel's 8-part series American Ripper focuses on this theory. Holmes's great-great-grandson, Jeff Mudgett, tries to prove that Hh Holmes and Jack the Ripper are one and the same. The thought is that Holmes escaped and traveled to London, where he continued his murder spree. I'll admit I haven't seen this one, and I probably won't watch it, because in 2017, Holmes's body was exhumed to prove his identity. Because his body was encased in cement, it did not decompose normally. His body was disintegrated, but his clothes were still completely intact, as well as his unruly handlebar mustache. It was still attached to his skull. They used his teeth to confirm that the body was, in fact, Hh Holmes. Therefore, not Jack the Ripper. I want to believe the story of the murder castle. It's way more interesting than saying the media made it all up. But the truth is, we will never know what really happened. It's a he said, she said story. There's no evidence to back up the murders, but I don't think it can be positively ruled out either. Martin Scorsese is producing a Hulu original TV series based on Eric Larson's novel, The Devil in the White City. I'm pumped to see their take on this moment in history. Leonardo DiCaprio is co-producing with Scorsese, but hasn't been confirmed yet if he'll be starring in the series, but I hope so. He would be an amazing Hh Holmes. It sounds binge-worthy. I'd love to know what my listeners think, so hop on my Facebook or Instagram page and tell me your theory at Killer Stories Podcast, or email me killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. Don't forget to follow and subscribe so that you never miss a new episode. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.